Everyone, it's Ajanette, and I am here to do your week one personality lecture. We're going to introduce you to the concepts of personality, give you a little bit of background, and kind of define personality to set the stage for our course this semester. And so let's dive in. We're going to draw on a couple of different resources. So just so you know, I'll walk you through the text you need to review for this week's content. I want to start by talking about psychology as a field. So by now you've probably taken an intro class, a survey of psychology, a general psych, but something that just lays the foundation to understand psychology. And you probably learned that psychology is a little bit different than maybe what you expected. Sometimes I get students that say, that they want to learn how to read people in this class, or they were drawn to psychology because they felt like they were really good at reading people. But psychology is more than quote unquote reading people. Psychology is actually a science. We're the scientific study of the brain and human behavior. And we're a very broad field. Within the field, we have different specialties, and each of those specialties focuses on a different thing. Biopsychologists really study the brain, and they study the nervous system and the endocrine system and the intersection between biology and psychological and behavioral functioning. And so neuroscience is born out of biopsychology. If you take psychology, you're going to learn a little bit about the brain and action potential and the different components of a neuron. And some students are kind of shocked by that, right? Clinical psychology is typically what most people think of when they think of psychology. These are your therapists. These are the people that diagnose psychological disorders and that treat psychological disorders and that just offer therapy to help people to support their personal growth and their relationship progression. Cognitive psychologists, when we talk about cognition, we're focusing on the mind. We're focusing on cognitive processing, thinking, memory, language, perception. So it's really not the brain per se, although we do study the different areas of the brain and structures of the brain that are involved in thinking, language, memory, things of that nature. But cognitive psychology itself might look at what are different what are different factors that impact memory. Comparative psychology actually is animal studies, and they draw upon those animal studies to see if it can offer some insight as to how that might occur within the human realm. For instance, with human sexuality, we draw upon our closest animal relatives, which are bonobos and chimpanzees, and we look at the sexual behavior among those animals, and then we see like what similarities does that share with human sexual behavior. And now it's important to note that like biopsych, excuse me, really does draw upon a lot of animal studies and animal research because, ethically there's things that they can't do with humans, and so they do it with animals. But care is taken to ensure that those animals are treated as humanely as possible, even if they are being used to conduct research. Counseling psychologists can be related to clinical psychology, but counseling psychologists typically take a broader field or perspective. So they're not always focused on pathology. They might be focusing on optimizing relationships, optimizing academic performance. They might counsel in a specific area or specialty that isn't necessarily dealing with diagnosing and treating individuals. And honestly, I think when we think of therapy and we promote therapy, we probably need more of a broader perception because our medical field makes us have a diagnosis and an order, a medical order, in order to be entitled to therapy that's covered by our insurance quite often. And we really need broader access, almost like a wellness coach, right? Developmental psychologists study how we change physically, cognitively, socially, and emotionally over the course of our lifetime, from womb to tomb. So they study from conception all the way through death and dying. So even the grieving process is part of that. Educational psychologists are school psychologists. They can be school counselors and or the psychologists that again do a lot of diagnoses, develop treatment plans. They're involved in the IEP process, and they really look at what strategies the school can implement or what kind of referrals can they offer to the parents and family in order to optimize their learning and overall growth and development. IO psychologist is really psychology intersecting with business, looking at how can we use our research skills, scientifically study human behavior in the workplace, and optimize motivation, productivity, and profitability. So it tends to be a very well-paid specialty, probably the highest paying specialty in the field. Forensic psychology is the intersection of psychology with the criminal justice field. So a forensic psychologist may assess someone for whether or not they're fit to stand trial, whether or not they're competent to engage and support their own defense. If you find somebody that wants to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, they would be assessed by a forensic psychologist. They might also be an expert witness brought in to bring a psychological perspective to the case, whatever it might be, whether it's criminal, family law, whatever it might be. They also tend to be paid very well as well. A lot of people want to specialize in forensic psychology and do something like behavioral analysis in terms of working for the FBI and pursuing serial killers and things of that nature as well. Military psychologists actually specialize in working with military members and their family and veterans. And so they are there to support their mental health and well-being and their overall functioning. Personality psychologist, which is most relevant to this particular class, is somebody that studies personality. It defines and studies the consistent and reliable traits of personality. It studies how personality is related to, in our case, like academic performance, how it's related to maybe our career selection, how it's related to our self-efficacy and our confidence and ability to do well. It might be something that we would examine as it relates to engagement in the classroom and how can we best support students of differing personalities so that they can, succeed in our time. And then a school psychologist really goes on with educational psychology, but an educational psychologist might expand and do private practice and do broader stuff to optimize learning, whereas a school psychologist is going to work directly for the district and do the IEPs and things of that nature. Intersecting fields, often your school and educational psychology falls into the School of Education rather than the School of Psychology or Social Sciences. So this is important because we're going to focus here on personality psychologists, and that's where the focus of our whole course is going to be, is diving deeper into understanding personality. Now, I do want to make sure that we recognize that there's no clear-cut answer, right? There's a couple of questions that are very common in the field. So we might hear is our personality inherited, or are we products of our environment? Going back to that whole nature-nurture debate in psychology. We're born the way that we are, or what we experience in the world shapes us into the person that we become. And in personality psychology, we're asking the same question as it relates to personality. Are we born with a distinct personality, or does our personality develop based on our lived experiences? And the answer is both, right? There's no clear one answer over another. And so we're going to study the different theoretical perspectives that might offer some insight, but we're not going to be able to answer that question definitively because it all depends on which theoretical perspective you have. Are we unique, or are there common types of personalities? Both, right? Unique and distinctive, but at the same time, we can categorize personalities. We have all different personality theories that categorize us differently, and we're going to cover some of the main ones in this class. Which is more important to our personality? Our past, like Freud would say, our childhood, our present and what we're experiencing now, which the behaviorists might say, or maybe even the future, which maybe a humanistic or existential perspective might say. Again, that psychological lens by which you view the world will help determine how you would answer this question. There's no right or wrong answer. Quite often, for most of these theories, there's research to support their perspective, absent the psychoanalytic perspective, right? Do we have free will, or is our behavior determined? So a deterministic perspective looks at there are factors outside of our direct conscious control that shape who we are. So Freud, it was the unconscious, right? Our childhood experiences and how we resolve those psychoanalytic stages, or those psychosexual stages. They would kind of influence that id, ego, and superego development, and that would influence who we are. We might have some traumas that we repress into our unconscious, and those shape who we are or how we respond or behave. There's also things like fate, right? If you believe like it's destiny, or you have some belief in some higher power and it's their will that things happen, and that might be considered deterministic. It's outside of you, even to some extent biology. That's not something I have direct control over, right? If my DNA determines my personality, I don't have control over that. Versus free will, me consciously, intentionally choosing to behave a certain way, or to engage in certain activities, or to express certain emotions, right? All of that is more of a humanistic perspective, where I'm in control of driving my own car and shaping my own life and my own future and destiny, including my own personality, as opposed to someone else is driving the car and I'm just on the bus for the ride, right? Very different perspectives. We're going to examine those a little bit more closely in some of our discussions and learning activity. So in terms of what are we hoping to gain as we dive into this new learning content? Well, we want to have a really good, solid understanding of personality and the various theoretical perspectives. We want to be able to understand what those perspectives have in common, how they differ, and how we approach psychology, understanding personality in the whole field, right? This week, we're going to draw on a couple of different learning modules, learning materials, including the OER module that's linked into your course shell, just lesson 2. And then we're also going to draw upon the first part of chapter 1 from the Kelland textbook. So in order to make sure that the textbook and learning materials are free for you throughout the semester, I'm going to draw on different resources, Kelland being one of the primary resources. But I want to look to the OER module to kind of lay some important foundational concepts for us. It's really simple, easy to understand. So in your course shell, make sure you link into the OER resources, read that chapter 1, include that in your reading. Now, it's going to open up with a discussion about what is personality. Personality is very distinct. It's different than emotions. I know I use emojis as a means of kind of visually showing this class and PowerPoint to introduce you to this concept of personality. In reality, personality is so much more than our emotions, but we definitely have personalities, our emotions associated with different personalities. So I like to think of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? Like grumpy, happy, sneezy. I would be like clumsy, right? Those individuals, those dwarfs, do have a pretty persistent emotion. Typically, emotions will moderate. Like I can experience sadness in a day, but overall, I'm not a sad person. I can experience joy and glee and excitement, but I'm also not the kind of person that's shooting rainbows out my ass either, right? I tend to be kind of a very emotional person. I feel my emotions very passionately, but at the same time, I tend to be a little bit more tempered in my emotional expression, particularly when I'm in a professional realm or setting, or I'm with people outside of my immediate circle, right? So personality tends to be very stable, it tends to be very fixed, it tends to be predictable. And yes, some of us have a certain emotional response that tends to be consistent throughout our lives and throughout different domains of our lives. And so that's how emotions might factor into personality, but personality is so much more than our fluctuating emotions. When we talk about personality, we're talking about drawing upon the word persona, which is a Latin word for mask. So it gives this impression that we put on masks. And I want to be cautious about that. Most definitely, we might have a very distinctive personality in one setting than we do in another, but that doesn't mean we're not being authentic to ourselves, right? For instance, I'm an introvert in a an extrovert in a professional setting. I can get up in front of a room, I can command an audience. I obviously am okay with public speaking. I'm a teacher, I'm a professor. That's what you do, right? You engage people. I can do professional development workshops, I can speak at conferences, but on a personal level, I actually don't like the spotlight. I do not want to be on stage. I am more of an introvert on a personal basis. And so I do want you to think about how personality might differ in different contexts, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's fake. It's a mask, it's a costume. It's a very normal part of expressing your personality, that you express it differently in different contexts. But our personality is still stable, consistent, fairly predictable, right? We might have occasional moods that impact our behavior and emotional expression, but most definitely we tend to have a distinctive personality that stays with us. So who I am in a work setting on one day is pretty consistent in who I am on every other day, right? So in terms of defining personality, personality includes long-standing traits or patterns. So they are persistent, they are consistent. It's not just a mood, it's not fluctuating, it's not we're this way one minute and this way another. It tends to be long-standing traits. I'm hardworking, I'm compassionate, I'm dedicated, I'm empowered. I tend to be shy at first and kind of quiet, but talkative. I tend to have very strong opinions. I tend to be a strong advocate, right? So think about those traits that are very common and persistent. It's a pattern in how you engage with other people and how you engage the world, right? It also then is a reflection and or influence on how I think, how I feel about the world, and how I might behave or engage in the world, right? Because I'm not the kind of person that's shooting rainbows out my ass, you're not gonna find me like bouncing around and hi, how are you? I'm gonna say good morning, right? How are you? Aloha. I'm not typically one to, be a hype girl. My friend recently got married and she wanted me to do a little emceeing at the wedding. And I was like, bitch, do you know me? I am not a hype girl. Like, that is not my personality. So I was like, okay, I'm going to slam down drinks. I actually, who I took with me as my plus one was impacted for this role because I needed someone there that could be a hype girl for me so I could be a hype girl in those roles, right? Because that wasn't my usual personality. So in that way, it differs from mood. Now, I was relying on, alcohol to make me a little bit looser, a little bit more fun, free-spirited, but typically that is not who I am in general, absent alcohol. So personality is long-term. It's stable. Like when you're around one person regularly and consistently, and then you come home and they're off, and you're like, what's up with you today? Why? Because you know what their usual normal patterns of behavior are. You know how they normally communicate and engage you and engage the world. And so when something's off, we see it. And that personality is that normal behavior, that normal engagement. Now, even though we might have patterns and we might be able to categorize people into different personality types, like an introvert or an extrovert, we are distinctly unique. We actually have research that identifies specific genes associated with our personality. We also have behavioral genetics, which is another area of psychology that actually wasn't addressed in the original slide. And behavioral genetics actually compares environmental influences compared to that of biological influences. It engages in twin studies, so it compares rates of personality, behaviors, characteristics, psychological traits, right, across individuals based on their different level of genetic relatedness. So comparing monozygotic twins to dizygotic twins to a regular sibling. And they see if a trait is more likely to be shared with somebody that's closer in genetic relationship, then it's believed that that particular trait has a strong biological or genetic basis. Personality actually has a strong genetic basis. When they do adoption studies, they have found that an adopted child actually shares a lot of personality traits consistent with their biological parent, more so than their adoptive parent. They may have learned some behaviors, some patterns, some skills from their adoptive parents. So we're in no way suggesting their adoptive family is not valuable to them, because they are. But when you get to the raw core of their personality, those genes and that genetic influence is undeniable. So we're going to now go through and engage in, I'm going to stop here, and I'm actually going to cut this into a couple of different parts so that we can ensure that the lectures are digestible. You can stop and take a break, because actually chunking your learning enhances your learning. So I'm going to encourage you to get up, go walk around, go grab a snack, drink water, open the window, breathe in some fresh air, listen to the beautiful birds outside, whatever it might be, but just take a quick little break and then come back and we'll talk about the historical perspectives in part 2 so that those can all be kept together, and now you're breaking up your learning. You're more likely, we call it the serial position effect, you're more likely to remember what you learned at the beginning well and what you learned at the end well, but you kind of forget what's in the middle. So if we chunk it out, we're creating more beginnings and more endings, and we're helping to naturally facilitate that learning process. So take a good break. I will do so myself as well. Enjoy.